Collins & Co. invite you to join us for our regular lunchtime not-for-profit seminars and workshops. In these sessions, guest speakers deliver expert knowledge on topics specifically catered for the not-for-profit sector. Sessions are held at Collins & Co. from 12 till 2 and lunch is provided. Contact Collins & Co. to find out the next seminar topic and to register.
Hi, I'm Robbie from Think Impact. Today I'm going to be talking about why impact matters and why an organisation should be impact-led rather than funding-led. I hope it's a great session. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'd just like to, as we start, acknowledge that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm somewhere on the following spectrum. The very first time I spoke in Australia, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I didn't understand one word you said, but I could listen to your accent all day. And the last time I spoke in Scotland, people came up to me and said, you're sounding very Australian. So you can sort of gauge where you think you are. Michael will do subtitles and translation later on, because as Michael said, we've known each other, I think it's probably 7, 8 years now. We're a small group, so I've got a lot of slides. We're not going to go through them all. We'll sort of try and pick highlights and really information that you want. So it'd be great to know who you are and what you really want to get out of the session. So what I'd like you to do quickly is turn to the person next to you and have a quick conversation around what would make this really useful, and then we'll pull out some key things from you as a group, and then I can tailor what I'm saying to make it a sort of useful 30 to 45 minutes for you. Okay, great. Really broad cross-section of interest and questions. I should point out, about 3 weeks ago now, maybe 4 weeks ago, I went and spoke at a conference up in Sydney, and then I was at an event that night, and your voice is slightly raised when you're talking at an event. I woke up the next morning, got my Uber, got into the cab. The Uber driver said to me, "You Kevin, are you going to the airport?" And I went, "Yes." And I'd lost my voice, and so it returned, but it's returned with a really irritating cough. So what happens is I look as if I'm about to say something profound. I'm not. I'm just struggling about, and I'm usually about to cough. So that's they maybe be edited out later on in the filming. Right, great. So I've got a lot of slides. As I say, I'll try and pick key things out across the slides in terms of the points that people were making. In terms of my journey into why I think impact matters for organisations and why we picked this topic of impact-led or dead, it really started near 25 years ago now. And I'm going to tell you two stories from when I was in Scotland just to illustrate a bit of background to this. And the first one started when I was at Lothian Drugs Initiative, and it was an exercise in absolute naivety. So I was the deputy manager of the organisation. This organisation received £2 million a year from the government to provide drug services to people that initially it started to reduce the heroin problem in Edinburgh, but by the time the building got opened, heroin had substituted to methadone, and so it was actually around detox or stabilisation of people on their methadone programmes. And at one point the board commissioned me and said, look, what we want you to do is to look at how we can improve our results, because the results of the programme weren't that great. And so I went off and I did my first piece of real research into what would make the difference, what was important in terms of the drugs field, how we could be working, what we should be doing. And what I identified was that if we took the £2 million that we had and we spent it on community drug services rather than a residential project, we would double our results overnight. And so I went back and presented this to the board. It was a short-lived tenure in that organisation because they didn't want to hear about impact. They wanted me to come up with some silver bullet as to how they could get better at what they were doing, when actually the research evidence was pointing in a different direction. And so I left shortly afterwards. I then went to work for Fourth Sector and was their chief exec for 7 years. We ran social enterprises to create jobs for people that were long-term unemployed because of severe mental health problems. I had a visit one day from the Minister for Social Enterprise, and it was one of these unusual visits. We used to get lots of MPs, lots of members of the Scottish Parliament, lots of members of the European Parliament coming to visit us, because we were quite near the new Scottish Parliament in terms of our location, and we had a hotel. And so people used to come to the hotel and come and visit it. The Minister for Social Enterprise came in, and usually the first question was, what's a social enterprise? And you didn't get beyond the definition in the 1 hour conversation with a general MP. He walked in and went, how is this financed? And I was like, right, you're the Minister for Social Enterprise. This is going to be a lot harder than I usually get in these conversations. And so he did this sort of really good conversation with me. And then he said, what do people get out of working here? And I said, look, we can tell you about qualifications that people get. We can tell you about people that move on into other employment. I actually think we do. The main impact is around people's health, but we don't know that and we can't prove it. And he said, can we speak to a couple of the guys? And so a couple of the guys that were working there got them up into the room to speak to the minister and sat them down. He chatted away to them, and then he went, what do you get from working at Fourth Sector? And it was a really interesting question on 2 levels. One, Fourth Sector was the name of the not-for-profit charity, but each of the businesses had their own names. And so people worked for Six Mary's Place, Rolls on Wheels, Parkview Laundry, Edinburgh Embroidery Services. They didn't even know who Fourth Sector was, so they might have gone who. But more importantly, I once described Scottish people as a bitter, twisted version of a POM. And so I was like, oh, really, I should have briefed them. Because what we could get is complaints about the tea breaks or the start times or overtime payments. But if I'd briefed them, I wouldn't have got the story that came out of these 2 guys' mouths. And the first guy went, in my darkest days, when I felt like killing myself, working here has been the thing that's kept me alive. And I was like this, like, you know, because as the chief exec, you don't get to hear that stuff very often. And the next guy went, oh, mine's is nowhere near as dramatic as that. I just know that since I've come to work here, I don't see my GP as much, I don't go to hospital as much, and I don't use my community psychiatric nurse as much. And so that was the health anecdote that I'd sort of been looking for, and it started me out in this little journey of trying to prove that. So I did local multiplier 3, social accounting, prove it, you name a tool in impact measurement, then I dabbled with them for a few years, came across this thing called social return on investment, which was developed out of the US. We came across it through guys in Holland, and then we had the second one in Scotland done on our organisation. And the Scottish Development Centre for Mental Health did an analysis on us. And what it ended up with as a narrative for us, and this was back in 2003, 2004 maybe, was we identified that the people that worked for us generally were 14 years out of work, 18 months in psychiatric care. On top of their mental health problem, they had a background of dual diagnosis intellectual disability or homelessness or drug alcohol problems or being ex-offenders or having been brought up in care. So it was hardcore, compounded, long-term unemployment with a whole raft of issues around it. The cost of the services they should have been in was £20,000 per year. Occupational therapy costs that we could price. And we supported them for about £5,000 per year. And for that 5,000 was made up of a mixture of philanthropy and money from various government departments. And for that £5,000, we provided £5.87 of social return for every pound that we got. And at that point, that was the most sophisticated narrative that anyone had around their impact in Scotland. And so it then opened a lot of doors, which led to me working in the Equal Project, which is a programme across Europe, looking at social return on investment, and ended up with me subsequently seconded to the UK government as an advisor in this around how you actually measured it. And it was that real beginnings of people starting to go, we need to think about our impact in a different way. So I came out to Australia 10 years ago, worked for Social Ventures Australia for 7 years. I trained their staff in terms of doing social return on investment, impact measurement. Then I went to be the chief exec of United Way for a couple of years. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then I joined Think Impact a year ago. So for Think Impact, how we think is every organisation does some form of good. Okay, you look at any organisation and it's virtually impossible to not find good in an organization and what it's doing. So there's all these little ripples of impact. And we are sort of inspired by this quote from Robert Kennedy around, these ripples of impact are out there. What can they do and what can they be and what can they change? And so for us, we're trying to make sense of the ripples. We're trying to look at the ripples that are happening and make sense of them, trying to find clarity amidst complexity, because we understand that impact measurement is very complex to do. And then from that, develop an impact-led strategy. And that bit's the important part for us, because it's a sort of counter-argument to the notion that we hear within a lot of not-for-profits that you should be funding-led and that you should focus your strategy around what funders want and need. And we think that's the worst thing an organisation could do. And they should actually focus there around the impact that they want to have and actually then get the right funders to come in and fund that impact. And so we call that impact-led strategy. So what changes in terms of if you come and have us support you? We help people to improve their understanding. So they improve their understanding of the impact they're making. We use a variety of tools. As I said, my background was social return on investment, but we're agnostic in terms of tool. We actually will use the right tool for the organisation. We help people improve their communication. So we do a lot of work around visual data dashboards, impact films, that sort of stuff. But most of our work is in this really interesting space of transformed impact. So now you know that that's the impact you're having. What do you do more of to actually increase your impact? And particularly, what do you stop doing where you're not having impact? And we think that's one of the hardest things for not-for-profit organisations to do. And I say that having spent 10 years of chief execs of 2 different organisations and another 10 years in senior roles in not-for-profit organisations. It's really hard for them to stop stuff. And they don't want to look at the evidence of what's working and what's not working. So we spend a lot of our time in the transformation space. And that's because we think that impact measurement kills people. It's a radical thought, and it's an article that's been written by Ross, who is our founder at the moment. But it's this notion that if we're only evaluating to justify our activity, then the status quo maintains. And actually, not-for-profits, we actually came into this because we wanted to change the world. If you go back to the origin of every single not-for-profit, there was some passion about changing the world. And so we think it's about reconnecting with that passion and actually then looking at what you can do to improve what you're doing. I'm not going to go through all these, but there are several factors that we think are really shifting the agenda in terms of creating strategic uncertainty and raising impact as a critical strategic response. Mergers and acquisitions are one of them. So organisations out in the not-for-profit sector getting larger and larger. What does that mean for small organisations? And we think they need to be focused around their impact in that space. There's a whole growth of social impact bonds, impact investing, there's tightening government budgets. So there's a lot of things happening there that are meaning that really the best thing to do is really get clarity on impact. Innovation is there as a critical thing for the not-for-profit space. How do you actually think about developing and innovating new products? And what's your, if in the private sector they're developing something, then they have the notion that they're developing to sell to new customers. What are we developing things for? It should be to actually improve the impact of what we're having. And lastly, how many people are on Twitter? Anyone? 1 or 2 people. This is my worst ever tweet. So about 5 years ago, I did a tweet which was, what's the connection between a black swan and the Alduin chopping stone? And those of you that are on Twitter, you know that when you tweet, what you're looking for is people to like it, people to retweet it, people to comment on your tweet. None of that happened. This tweet sat there lonely, alone and forsaken in Twittersphere with nobody responding to it, and it drifted off lonely into the distance. And so I bring it back into all my presentations just to show how much I love it and care for it. So does anyone know what the link is between a black swan and the Alduin chopping stone? Anyone heard of black swan theory? How many people have an Alduin chopping stone in their bag? Any hands up? No, no one. No. And so de rigueur, about For 1.5 million years, this was the piece of equipment that separated humans from animals. We carried around the Alduin chopping stone, we threw it at animals to knock them over, we carved off fur with the Alduin chopping stone, we smashed bones and we sucked on the bone marrow, and that's why human brains grew. And so it helped us to become who we are in terms of the ability, the brain growing and the ability to communicate. Why don't we carry them around now? There's no trick questions here. What's that?
There's probably an app for that.
There's an app for that. Yeah. Well, because we've developed, okay? Because we've developed new tools, we've developed new approaches. Anyone have any clue what that means in terms of the link with black swan theory? Anyone know what black swan theory is?
I just read this the other day and now I can't even think what it was.
Yeah.
Maybe I was reading, I don't know what I was reading.
Must have made an impression on
I know. Yeah.
So black swan theory is the concept that you will come across something that will completely flip on its head your concept of the world. And that was because when white people arrived in Australia, there was no concept of black swans. The rest of the world, there's only white swans, apart from Australia and maybe New Zealand. And I really should research whether New Zealand have black swans. But it's in Australia, black swans. Everywhere else in the world, white swans. And so this American guy's written this book around called Black Swan Theory, around what are the things that are happening that are turning on their heads how we conceive the world. And particularly we are in a period where the advance of technology is now so rapid that these things are just happening over and over and over again. How many of you have, anyone watched Blade Runner, the new one? A few people. So I watched it about a month ago. In the run-up to watching it, I watched the old one. So Blade Runner, the first one, was made in 1986, but it was conceived of being the year being 2019. And it was quite fascinating because in 2019, flying cars. What do we think? Flying cars going to be around next year? Nope. Not you think not far off, okay. But Harrison Ford uses a phone box. Like how many people when was the last time you were in a phone box? Like I can't even remember. Like there was no concept in 1986 of the smartphone. And for the bulk of the film, people are smoking in their office. So things that couldn't be seen have happened already, and that's the notion of black swan theory, that we're actually, stuff is going to change and rapid progress. And so again, within that world of rapid change, what's the anchor? And so we think impact should be the anchor. So as a not-for-profit sector, this is how we hope we work. We're out there, we compete for funding, we deliver our programs, and we create social impact. Everyone on board with that? This is actually how we work. Funding drives development. Survival trumps mission, benefit flows to activity rather than cause. And so we think how you should work is orientate around evidence and data, design effective solutions, and then your social impact's maximized. And even better still, create that evaluation loop to keep people like Think Impact in business, where you're looking at the impact you're having. And then to do that effectively, impact-led co-design means you need to be bringing funders, partners, the community and policy makers to collaborate with you in that design process. And so a lot of what we do is around how do you actually design bringing all your partners into the design process. And it's based on asking 3 very simple questions. What's the grand impact that you aspire to? What change are you currently delivering? And now you know what change you're delivering, what should you do differently to achieve the grand impact? And it was interesting, we did this, now I'm on film, I'm not going to name the organisation, but we did this piece of work recently with this organisation, very large, not-for-profit, you'd know them if I said who they were. They had as one of their strategic goals, how did they frame it? How can I phrase this in a way that doesn't give them away? It was a sense of belonging for young Indigenous Australians was one of their strategic goals. They had a raft of them, and this was one of them. And so we did a 2.5-hour workshop with a lot of staff in the organisation around, okay, what is the best indicator? If you can only choose one indicator, and we maybe talk a little about indicator selection later, but if you can only choose one indicator selection, that young Indigenous people in Australia have a sense of belonging, what would it be? And the indicator they chose was that they would see the dial shift in terms of youth suicide amongst young Indigenous Australians. That would be the best indicator that actually young Indigenous people had a sense of belonging. Everyone agreed it. Then within the organisation, there was mass revolt as everyone had conniptions about the fact that this was the indicator, because the reality was when you looked at their Indigenous programs that they were running for young people, none of them were in that space. And it was like, okay, so you have a strategy with a goal, with your outcome clear, with your indicator selected, and you're doing all this work over here. Why are you doing that work? And it was purely because that was where the funding was. So it was nothing to do with the strategy and the impact. And so that disconnect we see a lot of times. So it's, as we say, what do you do differently, how to achieve the grand impact? Why are you in business as an organisation? How many people know who this is?
Magnificent Seven.
Magnificent Seven, great. It's amazing. A few years ago, I had to go back to the UK in an emergency. And so I ended up having to back out of a talk like this and give one of my colleagues at SVA my slides to do my presentation, and did the presentation. And then a couple of months later, I saw him do the presentation, and he put this slide up. And so I put it up there, and I said to him, look, the reason we put this slide up is the Magnificent Seven, because there's 7 principles as to how you measure your impact. And I used to, years ago, make the audience hum the tune of the Magnificent Seven. Yeah. I'm not going to make you do that, because I've found less and less people actually know the tune, and everyone looks strangely at me like, why would you do that? But, so I put the slide up, he put the slide up in the presentation a couple of months later, and he went, you see, if you don't have principles, it's a bit like the Wild West. And I was sitting in the audience like you are today, and I was like, no! Now, I didn't shout that out because that would have been rude, but in my head. And so I went up to him and I said, why did you not talk about the Magnificent Seven? And he went, who? And I was like, Gen Y, too young, had never heard of the film, didn't even know who the slide was. So I spent a lot of my time lobbying Hollywood just to get the film remade, so that younger people would know what it was and what I was talking about. So this part's the interactive part. There are 7 principles as to how you should think about measuring impact. A cartoon will come up. You say what you think the principle is.
Transformation?
Yes. Close. You're in the transformation business. You're about making a difference. So you need to be able to understand and articulate what your theory of change is. What are you out there to do? You need to be able to understand that and communicate it.
Kill the bad ideas.
Oh, that's the best one I've ever heard in terms of what this is. This one always gets a groan, but that's really good.
What did she say? I'm sorry.
Kill the bad ideas.
Kill the bad ideas.
So involve your stakeholders. And the reason and rationale behind this is, I worked in the employment space for a long period of time. If you're in the employment space and you're talking to funders around what's the importance and the change that happens with someone getting a job, then generally if it's government or a philanthropist, they'll go, oh, there's a reduced reliance on welfare benefits and increased taxation that's paid. If you ask an unemployed person who gets a job what the value of a job is, I can guarantee you, and I've done this for 20 years, and I guarantee you that it's never going to happen on the basis of 20 years experience now. No unemployed person ever has said to me, you know what, reduce taxation and the fact that I'm paying more tax, that's why I've got this job. They're like, oh, it's the value of having a team. It's actually getting up in the morning and having something in my life to do. It's having increased disposable income. And so the value of a job for someone is different depending on the stakeholder you speak to. So the more stakeholders you speak to, the more understanding you'll have about the change that you're creating. Some of these are quite literal, and some of these are abstract. So this one's literal.
Where's your funding come from?
Show me the money.
Show me the money. Show me the money's close. Value what changes. Okay, so you're in the change business. You need to be able to put a value on that change that's taking place. This one's really abstract, unless anyone's ever sat through a Social Ventures Australia presentation. Any accountants in the room? We're in an accounting building. We should have had one accountant come in. So within accountancy, there's a principle called materiality. You can't measure absolutely everything. So the notion of finding the golden thread, only including what's material. And then to do that, you need to make a set of judgments. And so really just focusing on what is material in terms of the judgments that you need to, what are the judgments you make, help you choose what's material. Somebody once said, don't overcook it. That wasn't another good principle.
See clearly what you're doing.
Yep, close. Be transparent. Yep. So again, if you're measuring impact, you're going to need to make a set of judgments. So just be transparent about what they are. Be clear, and it's the social research idea of validity and reliability. So that if somebody else came along and was presented with exactly the same information, the same data, and the set of judgments you'd made, they should be able to reach the same conclusions. And that really covers from the point of view of this question of should impact measurement be done internally or externally. Within Think Impact, we drive organisations and go, look, we really think this should be part of your DNA. You should be doing it internally, but if you then have a staff member that does an evaluation piece, then you just need to make clear that it was an internal staff member that did it. And maybe there's a bit of bias that somebody needs to filter in or factor in as they're reading. It doesn't make it's right or wrong, it's just you're clear about what you've done.
Probably is.
Don't overclaim. You know, I've read lots and lots and lots of evaluations that when you read them, it's like, this organisation is amazing. We've cured all the ills in the world. And you look out the window and you're like, yeah, I don't think so, you know. And so it's based on this idea of be clear about what's happened and not overclaiming. Any mathematicians? If we've no accountants, do we have any mathematicians? I always dread there being a mathematician in the audience. How many people remember Pythagoras' theorem? Yeah, so this is Robbie's theorem of how you measure impact. And it's that idea that some people will say you can't measure impact to the long term. You need a randomized control trial, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't disagree with randomized control trials. I'm just saying if you're working in the front line in a small not-for-profit, a randomized control trial's unfeasible. So what do you do to understand impact? And the difference between outcome and impact is it's that longer term change that's happened when you've factored in a set of things. So the outcome has happened, the change has happened, but how sustainable was that change? So you came to this course or you came to this session and your confidence and understanding of impact measurement increased. But did that last until you got to the front door? Did it last till you got to the train station, or did it last for 3 months back in your office? So it'll drop off. It won't always remain the same. So factor in the drop off. Attribution. Who else contributed to that change? So when I talked earlier on about the work we did on the hotel back in Scotland, when we were doing that, when that analysis was done for us by the Scottish Development Centre for Mental Health, they worked out that 42% of the people that we had working for us as staff with mental health problems had also engaged with housing organisations that provided support to them. So from that point of view, we had to attribute 42% of the outcome to those housing organisations. What would have happened anyway? So this notion of dead weight. And again, so would people have got jobs? Again, I did a piece of work back in Scotland where there was, with this organisation, they decided, it was a government thing, they decided to give £10,000 to businesses that were recruiting people that were short-term unemployed. They were trying to reduce unemployment in Edinburgh to zero. And but when the evaluation was done, the company said it was really great to get the £10,000. 74% of them said, but we would have recruited that person anyway. So nearly 3/4 of the money had been wasted on the dead weight calculation. So the outcomes would have happened anyway. And were there any negative effects? So any displacement. So if again, in small business circles, we see this where it's like, let's pump money into this area to start up businesses. But actually what happens is you just have people from the neighbouring areas move in, start the business up because the money's there. There's no net increase in businesses and no net increase in employment. It's just within one particular area. So you just have to factor those things in, and then also recognising that, particularly for organisations that work in systemic change, you have to think about contribution. No one organisation can bring about change alone. So actually, what's your contribution? So there's the things you need to think about when you're thinking about impact. And then the last one, I really should get accountants just to hang around for this one day. So verify your results. So if you've done impact measurement piece, actually get it verified. Have someone else to look at it, have someone peer review it, have someone check what you've done. And again, this came out of when we were working in Scotland around the social return on investment space, seeing people get to the point where once they'd done all the deadweight attribution, displacement calculations, they didn't like what they got. And so I once saw an organisation that just went, oh, we don't really like that, we'll just take it all out. And they published their report ignoring all those things. And so it's back to over-claiming. So get it verified if you're going to go public with stuff. So they're the principles that underpin the approach. And this is how we do a piece of work around theory of change as the sort of anchor piece around this. How many people are familiar with theory of change? People have heard of it? Yeah. Yeah. So the initial model Kellogg's Foundation did in the 70s was inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes. So we've sort of done a homage to that as that's traditionally how people have thought. Generally then at the end, impacts come into the space and people are looking at the longer term changes. For us, having done several hundred theory of change pieces of work now at Think Impact, we think that actually most of the work needs to be done here. And you don't just start with the money you've got, you start with the intended change that you want to create. And that's influenced by the context you operate in, the stakeholders, the evidence and data around what you're doing, and your belief. And that last one's important because we often operate out of motivation and belief. And what do you do when evidence comes along and contradicts your belief? And so really it's what's that? Yes, I've seen a lot of people who believe harder. And so again, it's just working in that space of like, well, actually the evidence is telling us something different. And so what's the issue you're working in? And really that then drives how you should think about this. We're about to change this. Literally this will be about the last time this slide's shown. And because we're about to introduce at the end a different way of framing the impact piece. So it'll actually go in like that. So that's outcomes. And we're taking the notion a stage further in terms of going almost like when you're communicating your impact, your theory of change then becomes your story of the change you want to create. And if you think of it like a prism, and I'm not going to pretend to have any geological understanding here now, but a prism, white light goes in, and then it's diffuse at the end, and it comes out and it can be seen in different ways. And that's actually how we think your story of change will go through, almost like a prism in terms of the impact. And when it comes out, you actually communicate it in different ways according to the different audiences that you're talking to. And so a lot of our work at the moment is working with organizations around how do they communicate their impact to the different audiences they've got. And so if you think back to my story earlier on about fourth sector when I was the chief exec, at this point, at the top of the prism here, my dad was a taxi driver, so I speak to taxi drivers. So I remember getting taxi drivers and people would be like, what do you do, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, run businesses to create jobs for people that are long-term unemployed. So you've got a really very short message as to what you do here. The change that's created is people have jobs that wouldn't have had jobs before. And you don't need to get beyond that because that's the conversation you might have with the person in the street. At the bottom of that pyramid or prism, if I'm in a conversation with government, then that's where it's like, this was how we did our social return on investment analysis. This is what we found out about it. This were the results. This is how we factored in dead weight. If I said that to a taxi driver, wouldn't get anywhere. So it's that audience segmentation and the prism, but what's coming into it is the same story. And so we're doing a lot of work with organisations around that and thinking about that, and so about to change this diagram. But through doing social return on, through doing theory of change work, we've learned 5 lessons that we think are critical, and this is what I'm going to finish on. Focus on the impact, not the activity. So you're all out there doing stuff. Generally, when you ask someone, what they do, they can tell you. When you ask them what the impact is, they struggle a bit. But really, we are in the impact business. And so it might be that you want to get across the ocean. Well, is building a bridge the best thing to do? So focus on impact, not the activity. Get the foundations right. So as we said, that's the context, the stakeholders, the evidence, the beliefs that are driving you. Because if you don't get those foundations in place and you only start with the money you've got, then actually you're not going to build effectively. Beware of miracle leaps. How many people are familiar with the term miracle leaps? Nope. So in the theory of change space, and this happened when I went into work at United Way. So I turned up at United Way as the chief exec. They just won a Theory of Change award. So I thought I was going into this organisation that was, amazing, doing amazingly well. And I was like, what's the theory of change of what you do? Now, I knew them for something that they'd done in the homelessness space, that they'd stopped. 85% of their work was in the early learning space, where they went, we send books to kids in disadvantage. So we go into disadvantaged area, we saturate the area with books, I'd sign people up to programs, and then we send books to their home, and then these kids learn to read, and then developmental vulnerability will be reduced. That was effectively their theory of change. Can anyone tell me what the miracle leaps within that are? One of them is really simple, one of them is a bit more complicated.
That they'd know how to read.
Exactly, right? So they know how to read. All the research says that if you want to get kids to read, I've got a 3-year-old, so if you want to get kids to read, you actually have to engage with the parents. Sending a book through the door is not going to get a child to read. You actually have to have some sort of parental engagement process. And so I was like, what do we do to engage the parents? Nothing. Why not? We just send the books. It's our unique selling point. I'm like, we're giving the books away. We're not selling them. We don't need a unique selling point here. Why aren't we working with the local libraries? They're the competition. I'm like, they're a free service. They're not the competition. But this was an organisation that had come, they're a big US organisation. They were funding driven. They were like, we've got a product we can sell to funders. Do not interfere with that process by giving us your miracle leap bullshit. We actually just want to sell books to funders and have funders buy it. The second most significant miracle leap is developmental vulnerability is assessed on 5 things. So it's the AECD, and I can't remember them all, but it's like physical health, mental health, resilience, communication, and one other. So giving a child a book does one of the 5 things. It doesn't do anything on the other 4. And so I had Think Impact come in and do work with the team when I was the chief exec. And I remember Ross at one point talking to one of the staff and was like, well, maybe one of the things we have to do is change the goal. And rather than saying we're going to reduce early childhood developmental vulnerability, what we should say is we're going to improve early childhood literacy. And this person went, no, we're going to reduce developmental vulnerability. And it's like, but you're only doing one of the 5 things. That's like saying you want to win a triathlon and all you do is run. And the person went, we run really well. And Ross was like, but you don't swim or cycle. And they went, but we run really, really well. Believe harder. And so they were just stuck in that miracle leap, that if we do this one thing, we're going to shift the dial on 5 things. And so thankfully the head of community impact in the organisation got this, and she started reconfiguring, she joined just after me, reconfiguring all the programmes in the areas they were working with to build collaborations, to pull people in that were nutrition organisations and kids' mental health organisations, because it's going, well, if that's the goal, we need to actually work differently. So we see miracle leaps in people's thinking all the time. don't overlook the underlying issues. So there's a whole model out there called the iceberg theory of systems change, and I see this a lot in the employment space, which is my background of someone's unemployed, we just need to get them a job search course to get them a job. Well, not if there's lots of unemployed people in the area. And actually what you're finding is that there's structural unemployment because our factories just closed down, or there's institutional unemployment because of racism that exists or mental health stigma. And so you actually need to look at all the structural and systemic issues that are there to actually understand what you should be doing to make the change. And then the last one is measuring impact, and we as I say, we do the homage to the original Kellogg's model, but our experience is it's not linear. You don't go input, activity, outputs, outcomes. It's a lot more fluid than that, and within that you've got to find the right level of complexity for you and your organisation. I've talked a bit about Ready to Read. So in terms of United Way, we ended up with this as a theory of change. So I'd worked in the organisation, did the whole strategic plan with Think Impact, came in, helped us rethink through stuff. And essentially this organisation then got to the point of going, there are postcodes of entrenched disadvantage in Australia. The dial hasn't shifted on them for the past 15 years. You've got the research evidence from the dropping off the edge report, etc. We don't want to be a service delivery organisation. We actually want to work in a different way, which is around bringing business, government, philanthropy and the community sector together, service providers to actually collaborate to try and tackle issues. And we think that what we'll do is improve education, employment, housing and health. So it was a very, very high level theory of change. It had elaborate diagrams behind it, but this was what we went out after a year of work and doing the evaluation and doing the strategy and presented. When this was presented at the, either the AGM or the, where it was launched, one of the staff who'd worked in the organisation for 7 years came up to me and said, this is the first time I've actually understood what we do. And he'd been there for 7 years. And so it was that, doing the evaluation to then take the understanding to build a new strategy with a very high level theory of change that then drove the different thinking within the organisation. Endgame, that was the other thing that, I'll finish on this one. This was the other thing that that was really quite interesting in terms of the organisation and really quite interesting in terms of thinking. This is a piece of work that's been done out of the US, out of Stanford. I don't think it works as well in terms of their definitions in an Australian context, and we are doing a bit of work trying to rethink through them. But it's this question that organisations, not-for-profits, should ask themselves: what's your end game? What are you actually here for? And is it open source? Do you want to develop solutions that you want everyone to adopt and you're going to give away? Is it replication? So you actually want people to copy you? Are you wanting the government to take on board what you're saying in terms of mainstreaming what you're doing? Is it something that you're developing that's a commercial driver that actually you want to build a social enterprise out of it? Are you ever going to achieve your mission? And then you're going to close down as an organisation because what's happened is breast cancer's cured. We no longer need legal advice in our Melbourne, you know? Do you think in a mission achievement way, or are you just going to be a built-on sustained service? And so again, we think that some of this needs a bit of rethinking, but it's a really good article. You can find it online if you look up what's your end game. It's out of Stanford Social Innovation Unit. And so we do a lot of work with organisations, get them to think around this. And this was like United Way, when, as I said, I went as the chief exec and I got Ross and Susie, the team at United Way, to come in and do the work for us. It was like people ran into a brick wall when they hit this because they'd never thought about it. It was just like, we just got to sell more without actually thinking about what the purpose of the organisation was. So I'm just going to finish there.
Thank Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.